people in the audience, I don't know, you can't see the audience, so you're just going to see us for now, but we might open it up later to some questions if there are any, and if we have enough time for it. I mean, we have to wait for Katya, right? Okay, if you just bear with us for a bit, I'm sure she's in a second.
Should we switch off the monitor?
Oh yeah, we should probably switch off.
Hi, Rudo. Hello. Welcome. Hi. Pretty well.
I don't know if you can see all of us. Do you want to come a bit over here?
You can see.
Yeah, you can see it.
Okay, cool. So you can see and hear us, all right? Okay, perfect.
Hello. Hi. Thanks for coming. Yeah, so all our guests are online because of different reasons. We're here. The panel of today is titled Mapping and Sensing Thresholds. And I'm going to briefly read you a blurb just as a form of introduction. We're going to have a quick 10 minutes recap of our project, sort of. Then our guests are going to introduce part of their practice with a quick 15 minutes each sort of presentation. And then we prepare some questions for them. We're open to Q&A if anybody from, over there wants to ask anything. So yeah, mapping and sensing thresholds. We would like to instigate a collective conversation around modalities of visual and spatial representation to explore the limits of sensing and mapping. Sorry, just checking.
Heading out quite a bit.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe you just switch seats and you get.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No. Do you hear me better? Yeah? Cool. Okay, perfect. So, back again. So, to explore the limits of sensing and mapping and how they can be pushed and stretched further into proposing alternative visual accounts so that we could counter violent environmental and humanitarian gazes and narratives performed through maps and bring forward new ones. So today we propose to explore experiences of collective field narrations, of recordings, of GIS mapping, of mapping toolkits, to understand and navigate between alternative forms of sensing, either from above or from the ground. We have three guests, which Marvi is going to introduce right now.
Thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to introduce our three speakers. So Imani Jacqueline Brown is an artist, activist, and a researcher from New Orleans. Her work investigates the continuum of extractivism from settler colonial genocide of slavery to fossil fuel production, gentrification, and police and corporate impunity. Dr. Nishat Awan is an academic and spatial practitioner whose research interests include the production and representation of migratory spaces and border areas. She explores how these issues can be addressed through spatial practice, in particular thinking about maps as topological entities. Rudolph Kemper works with digital democracy and manages creation of the Earth Defenders Toolkit. Rudo is a human geographer with a background in archives and international administration. His interest focuses on using technology to support marginalized communities in defending their right to self-determination and representation.
Feel free to add whatever we might have missed, just in case. No? Okay. Cool.
Great. Should we start off with the presentation? Yeah. Cool. So we thought at the beginning we're going to share a bit of our own research that we've done throughout the year. I'm going to start and share the screen. So. Do you can't see that anymore. Do you see that? Can you see and hear us?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna switch to full screen. So I'm gonna start and talk a little bit about my research. My research is called Sensing Skies and is looking into the shift from sea to sky in the border environment of the European Union. So it's looking into border control and the actual rise to area surveillance. And it is quite crucial because the duty to rescue people in distress at sea is like manifested in a lot of legal frameworks, like the United Nations of the Law of the Sea, but they all are made for maritime vessels, so they don't apply to aerial assets, meaning that the purchase of the aerial apparatus that the European Border and Coast Guard Agency Frontex is doing is leading to them being in a legally grey zone of responsibility because there's no law defining what they have to do once they spot a boat in distress from an aircraft. So I've been looking into this aerial apparatus and how they intensified their flights. And to uncover the shift from sea to sky, I created a website that was using a data set mapping the flights of Frontex on top of each other. So you can see these are the flights in 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. And the data set gets more and more correct because there are more sensors throughout the years, so you have a bit of full data in every year, but you can really see how they're like focusing on the central Mediterranean throughout the years. And I've been looking into I created an archive of incidents that connects interceptions that mention aircraft to stories, so you can really see that a lot of times, like in this case, the aircraft hovers around looking for a boat in distress. And in this case, for example, the flight track stops in front of the boat in distress. So what is a bit problematic in my research is that there are a lot of gaps in these flight tracks. So you can't don't have the full flight track, and it's not clear why these gaps exist. So if it's because they switch off the transponders or because of a bad signal in the central Mediterranean. So this is kind of one of the thresholds I've encountered. We might talk a little bit more about thresholds and mapping later, but yeah, just to start up a bit about my project.
Great, because you ended the gap. Wonderful. So yeah, my research investigates environmental harm and thresholds of environmental harm in a region in the south of Italy, which is an oil extraction hub, and it's called Making Sense. And sort of in order to kind of gather and collect those interpretation of petrochemical pollution that sort of always stays under the threshold of like possibilities of scientific monitoring, I sort of created this platform which approaches the claims that citizens, activists, and scientists are bringing together in that specific territory and geo-reference them and samples them. I divided it through 4 different lenses, which sort of look at how matter in excess, and in this case is oil and waste, sort of emerges from the soil, in the water, in the atmosphere, and in animals, plants, and human beings. I started from an underground oil leak that happened in 2017. So what I do in this sort of mapping exercise and practice is to bring together different levels and different interpretation of harm and environmental harm in order to sort of collect claims for justice, environmental and humanitarian justice, and create this sort of like counter narratives to counter the sort of politics imposed by the state and by extractive corporations. I try to sort of like not really aim at a comprehensive atlas, but rather to sort of like push those thresholds of interpretation and fill in the gaps that I could sort of detect in kind of official recordings, so official data set of pollution, that are monitored mostly by extractive corporation and state. So this platform navigates those four matters, and what it does is adding interviews that I perform, I sort of had both on the field, so real people speaking to me, and also on Zoom or online. So here is more about filling those data sets that people are just sort of like reinterpreting and sort of connecting to what they feel and what they sense. Here is about sort of like visualizing and translating what happens in the environment between them. And it also collects these sort of more sort of legislative kind of layers that have an impact on how soil and water is used. So I'm gonna give it to Marvi.
Just a second. Before I show you the video, I just want to share the background of it and how I worked with my field work. So in my work, the field notes had long format interviews, which were very important. I used WhatsApp, data sharing, and voice notes as a method to work with. This was a very intimate space of sharing data, a journey between state data and field notes, a form of our thresholds, what we've been talking about. So I documented approximately 125-kilometer long breakwater, also known as South Asia-Pakistan Terminal, all the way to military-run Institute Defense Housing Authority in Phase 8. So as I gathered these field notes in the silence of uncertainty and unknowingness, there were these nodes which became a space for a pause. These pauses were between land and sea, contested and entangled between public and private spatial geo-coordinates. And this is where I started looking at the city from the lens of sea. And one of the important short narratives that I used it as a lead point in my work was this Stealing from the Sea, a short story. And I'm going to quote it from that. One of the onlookers called out, "Where is the sea?" Nobody answered him. "Where is the sea?" he asked again. There were very few people to answer him, but really what could anyone say? Where could the sea vanish to? It must be here somewhere. You probably need to look around a bit more attentively. This is a definite sign of a bigger calamity, another voice was clearly heard saying. Could it be due to an oil spill, an ecological disaster, a local affect, a nuclear holocaust? This is a short narrative from Stealing from the Sea. So I'm going to show you the video.
अगर देखा जाए तो 18th अमेंडमेंट से पहले जो इंडिविजुअल क्वार्टर्स थे जो वो फेडरल गवर्नमेंट और प्रोविंशियल गवर्नमेंट दोनों शेयर करते थे, दोनों किया था, पर जो कोस्ट है वो कोस्ट प्रोविंशियल गवर्नमेंट का था। पर क्योंकि जो कराची के अंदर DHA और फिर पोर्ट अथॉरिटीज ये हमेशा रही हैं हमारे फौजी भाइयों के पास।
कॉलेज एजुकेशन चीज जितना भी ग्रीनरी नजर आ रही है ना आपको वो सब उन्हीं के पास है, वेल मेंटेन
अरे प्लॉट्स थोड़े थोड़े बने हुए हैं।
जी असल आपके पास एक गूगल मैप में एक और ऑप्शन है कि अगर आप देखना चाहेंगे कि आज से 5 साल पहले ये जमीन कैसी थी तो वो नक्शा कम करके दिखाएगा कि ये जमीन थी नहीं। हाँ टाइमलाइन आप पहले पीछे जाके देखेंगे तो कुछ भी नहीं था, तो इसी तरह वो पूरा जो है ना पीछे किए जा रहे हैं, समंदर को खाए जा रहे हैं।
हम जब शिकार में जा रहे होते हैं तो हमारा गुजर जो होता है वो अपनी जज़ायर से होता है कि हम अपने जजीरों को देखते हुए और अपनी कश्तियों को देखते हुए जाते हैं, तो उस वक्त एक मंजर एक अलग ही होता है। लेकिन जब हम लौटते हैं शिकार से तो उस टाइम पे जो फेज 8 का एरिया है जहाँ पर ये क्रीक विस्टा नजर आ रहा है या दूसरी जो डेवलपमेंट्स हुई है वहाँ पर वो नजर आ रही होती हैं, एमआर की डेवलपमेंट्स हैं, हाइपर स्टार हो गया, और डीप सी इतना साफ होता है, ब्लू कलर का होता है कि हमें वहाँ से वो गुमा होता है कि जिस तरह से दुबई हो गया या यूरोप हो गया, या और फिर इस तरह लगने लगता है कि जैसे हम फलस्तीन में हैं और वो इसराइल है, वहाँ की डेवलपमेंट। और सेम यही हमारे साथ जो मर्ज आइलैंड है मनोड़ा, वहाँ भी इतने खूबसूरत कॉलेजेस, स्कूल्स और सारी चीज़ें हैं। तो उस हवाले से हमें ऐसे ही लगता है कि हम किसी और दुनिया में इतनी डेवलपमेंट हो रही है वहाँ पे जो हमारे यहाँ पे नहीं है।
There you go. Do you see us? No. Wait, sorry.
No, I think it's fine.
No.
They can see us.
Do you see us again? Yeah? Yeah. No. Okay. Okay, bizarre. No, because I don't want to screen everyone.
Otherwise, you can go on.
I think it's just the view. Y'all are in the top right corner.
Yeah, that's not. What if? Oh, I see one in the corner. Oh,
That's fine.
yeah.
I think it's fine if we're in the corner.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. That's fine.
That's strange. Okay.
Maybe it's fine. If they see us, it's fine. I'd say.
Do you wanna?
Yeah. Okay. So I think we all had like really different approaches to our research and the way we included mapping in our projects. I'm coming from more like a remote sensing perspective, using like an existing data set to map something out that hasn't been mapped out before, whereas Kate is more in this field between science and sensing, and Marvi's using ethnographic field nodes to actually map something out. And we're hoping of having like a conversation about like the difficulties of mapping, but first we would like to hear from our speakers a bit more and seeing their projects and like how they encountered mapping in different ways, and maybe Imani wants to start off.
We thought of you, Imani, but
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it was really fantastic to see all your projects. Very interesting. Let me try to share the screen. Guess it only allows. Okay. I'm gonna share one. So I don't know.
that's great. We see your desktop.
Are you seeing? But okay. It seems like it only. Okay, switch screen. Okay, I guess it's only giving me the option to share one. But can you see it? I don't see it on the screen.
No, we're only seeing your background, your desktop background.
I don't know what that is though. So something's up. Because that's not even what it looks like. So maybe it's whatever this view is that's giving us trouble seeing y'all is also impacting the way share screen is showing up.
How about we all reconnect again? But now, do you want to try again?
Yeah, but this is your content view, I think that's what we're seeing.
It's quite weird. I don't have the option to like share a different view even, you know?
Oh.
I don't know what to say. There's everything is like kind of on the desktop right now.
Why don't
I mean, everything is like in front of the.
maybe someone else can try to share, and while they do, you can send me your presentation, and we'll have it on the laptop here. Sorry.
Great.
I don't know.
That works.
Nishat, do you want to try?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Okay.
Sort of. Alphabet? Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Yeah,
Okay.
that works. Okay, Imani, just send me your presentation, and I'll put it on the laptop here. If that works for you.
Should I start? Or?
Yes, please.
Okay. Imani, do you mind just muting yourself because I can hear you type? Okay, so I'm going to talk about this project that I've been working on for a few years called Topological Atlas, which is a research that investigates the relationship between border technologies, technologies of border security, systems of documentation, border landscapes, and the experience of crossing borders without papers. So to put it very simply, we're sort of combining field research with digital methods of mapping and sensing. Oh, you can't see the screen anymore. Hold on. Actually, I can't cover it. Can you see it okay right now?
Yeah, not so okay, but we can.
Weird. Hold on. Oh, yeah. I'm not sharing anymore.
No.
Okay, I'm not sure quite what happened there.
Okay, we're
Okay, it should be loading now. So.
Yeah.
Okay, so we say like this guy. Can someone tell me if it works, and then I can start the review?
Yeah, it works now.
Okay, let's try it then. So yeah, as I was saying, the work really, it combines field research with digital methods of mapping and modeling, and somehow one of the things that we're thinking about is how to sort of challenge a little bit, let's say, the evidentiary edge within, architectural research, but also social research. And so we're sort of beginning to explore ideas around affective witnessing, accountability, and opacity in relation to the circulation and unsettlements of migration. So that, as I said, we're interested in forced movement, which of course includes refugee movements, but also those who've had to move through structural injustices, whether economic or otherwise. And here I suppose we're starting to use the term displacement rather than migration, just because it includes those who are forced to flee not only across geopolitical borders, but those who are internally displaced through conflict, land grabs, climate, etc. And these are of course situations that are more prevalent in the global south, although of course they're happening in the north as well. And in Pakistan, where we've been working for the past couple of years, displacement is kind of all of these things happening at once, and that's somehow what produces the complexity. And the question of migration, at least in my home discipline of architecture, but I would say more widely within kind of within migration research tends to fall into two themes. On the one hand, there's this kind of idea of thinking through, refugee camps, temporary shelters, and through the lens of crisis and emergency. And on the other hand, you have something that can be encapsulated through the term arrival cities. So questions around the integration of people within already existing communities. So here you can think about where this movement comes from, and I would suggest certainly comes from centering the perspective of the North, the concern for refugees when they arrive at the shores of Europe or in the space of international NGOs, or when they arrive in northern urban centres. So I guess somehow the work tries to shift a little bit the perspective. We start from the global south, or from the places people need the space from, and at the same time we try to, there's a kind of desire to move beyond the language and temporality of crisis, and thinking through the mundane everyday aspect of displacement here, thinking particularly with Elizabeth Bovinelli's term quasi-event, this idea of an event that never becomes a fully fledged noteworthy event, but somehow remains below the level of the spectacular. Okay, so this is Marie's case, a place we've been working in for quite some time. It's a village in the Pakistani province of Lahore, just north of the city. Sorry, the Pakistani province of Punjab, just north of the city of Lahore. And then here, displacement could be thought of in the way that Rob Nixon speaks of it. He calls it a kind of more radical notion of displacement, where it's not only talking about the movement of people, but also kind of, and I quote from him, refers rather to the loss of the land and resources beneath them, a loss that leaves communities stranded in place. And so in Marie's case, certainly this is happening, and at the same time, somehow something like almost 80%, maybe a little bit more, of the people who are kind of moving from Pakistan towards Europe come from this particular area, like Marie's case. So somehow here we can see how the type of displacement that Rob Nixon is talking about then links to the kind of bigger displacements of undocumented migration. And so somehow, to quite simple point, but how we imagine displacement and migration is important for then how we begin to represent its effects through maps and drawing. Again, we know for most of the world's population, it is not this kind of simple linear journey from A to B, but it's full of stops and starts. But at the same time, the racial production of contemporary borders is somehow designed to keep people moving, this kind of system of circulation that includes deportation regimes, precarious lives, militarized borders, that somehow create a global underclass, right? Wanted and not wanted within the fortified spaces of northern privilege. The image you see is actually from an older project where I was sort of speaking to a Syrian activist who left Syria right at the beginning of the conflict. But I'm using this image because it really shows this idea of circulation, of how he's trying to find a place to somehow settle. And so in this sense, if we agree that forced migration today is in fact a system of circulation, then of course the very notion of the arrival city and things like that is sort of completely overturned. And so we then might begin to try to think with notions of unsettlement or unbelonging. So my research follows one of these circulatory routes from Pakistan towards Europe and back again, and I sort of use the term towards advisedly in the sense that most people, of course, don't know they get anywhere near Europe, and they're either deported back, pushed back, sent back, they might give up, they might decide to go home, etc. So there's only a few that arrive even at the edges of Europe. So this is a place called Gawaza that you see on the image, and it's an important node within one of these circulations, these routes that I was speaking about. But it's also an important node in another kind of circulation, which is China's Belt and Road Initiative. So I'm sure you've all seen this map before. But those who know Gawaza only through its place within this map, which is the New Silk Road project, might consider it as no more than a fishing village prior to China's interests. But others might remember Gawaza's historic place within the old Indian Ocean trade network, and of how the Gawadis think of themselves as connected to the cosmopolitan systems of the world. So with this image, you can see how the Gawadis sort of orientate themselves towards the sea and not northwards, inland towards Pakistan. And so this for me brings another sort of important question about how, places are understood and misunderstood at a distance, and the difficulty of apprehending places at a distance across difficult borders. And this is something that has very much been provoked for me by the sort of muddy, volatile landscape of Gawada. So in 2013, there was an earthquake in the area that destroyed many homes in Gawada and all along that area. And it also created these things that you see on the video, which is an island just off the coast of Gawada. And it was named Selva, the island mountain, by the local people. And in sort of trying to find out more information about this event, I came across the YouTube video that you're seeing on the screen, and of course you see all these people kind of wandering around on the island and looking at the dead sea life that's sort of been pushed up by the force of the seabed rising. And then at one point you see this kind of bubbling sort of muddy hole, and a little bit later, you'll see it in a second. I don't want to skip the video in case I mess up the presentation. These are actually the fishing vessels of Gawada, which was part of the local area who is still fishing, of course. Let's see, yeah, so at this point you see someone sort of lighting a match near a bubbling muddy hole, and suddenly it catches fire. And so this video was hosted on a channel by someone who usually records or posts videos of UFO sightings and other supernatural events, and screenshots and the side of the UFO VNI are from that channel. And seeing this video on that forum, I felt that there was something kind of strange going on, or there was something more to be said about the relationship between the landscape and the geological and cultural relation that is also produced and influenced by media and the platforms that are used to host and produce such knowledge, including YouTube, but I would say also other geospatial technologies that have been sort of already alluded to in the previous presentation. And you know how this is all completely entwined with the production of contemporary borders and the worldviews that underpin them. Of course, that one of the main ones of those is sort of seeing and knowing at a distance, and how these are also forms of fiction, or at least this straddles the line between fact and fiction. So another aspect of my work sort of deals directly with unpacking the intricacies of fictions of contemporary mapping technologies and how they're implicated in the production of bordered worlds. And I guess also the message of a borderless world. So here I'm going to switch modes a little bit and sort of talk about the question of the atlas. The project is called Topological Atlas. So I've written before about this idea of mapping otherwise, which was sort of following a lot of feminist sort of work on mapping and thinking about it through an embodied, situated way. So, and so really I'm sort of trying to think that, what would an atlas otherwise look like? So we are told, of course, that the word atlas comes from Greek mythology. It conjures up an image of this titan god holding the world on his shoulders, and of course it adorns the colors of, the atlas, the original atlas, let's say, European understandings, which is of course Mercator's compendium. But as with most myths, the origins of atlas are unclear. So some think that the figure of Atlas is based on the Egyptian god Shu, who is the god of air, and in one interpretation his name also means the one who holds up. But he wasn't holding up the world, the planet, but instead he was holding up one of his children, the goddess Nut of the sky, while below him was his son, the god Geb of the earth. And with the help of his sister and wife Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, she was separating his children in order to break apart their endless embrace. So one of the things I was sort of thinking with it, what difference would it make to pick Earth representations from the point of view of Shu rather than that of Atlas? Shu allows us to think of our inhabitation of the world as of the Earth as spacing, so this openness that we've been given between the Earth's crust and the void of space above. Yet Shu didn't exist on his own, he's held by Tefnut, and his whole reason to Earth is to keep apart his unruly children. That is, the space that we have been given is of course dependent on the Earth's thick surface and the heavens above, but crucially also includes the moisture in the air. So perhaps we could say that Shu was unsuccessful in the attempt to keep his children apart from morning dew in cycles of condensation and evaporation, standing his testimony to a forbidden union that was perhaps endorsed by the mother, the goddess of moisture. And so this is an attempt somehow to think through the Atlas otherwise, not from the point of view of the Olympian gods, neither from that of his Egyptian counterpart, but instead with what occurred despite Shu's protestation, through the entanglements of the earth, the air, and moisture. So the traditional discourse in cartography often revolves around this question of projection, right? How do you unfold the three-dimensional globe into two dimensions while keeping shapes and distances intact? Yet somehow whichever projection is used, the Earth's surface is represented as a flat geometrical plane, sometimes with contour texture. This representation considers the world as globe with a sealed and impermeable surface. It doesn't account for the seepage of water through the ground, or the burrowing of animals through soil. Neither does it account for the folding and slippage of tectonic plates, nor the whispered communications of the forest canopy or its underground fungal network. So if you were to rethink the atlas through the entanglements of matter, moisture, and our own atmospheric habitation, then we would have to think of its role as an archive. And of course, it's a very difficult archive full of colonial invasions, land grabs, and slavery. And we would also have to rethink this impermeable surface in order to reimagine it beyond this sort of now very familiar question of projection. And I would also say that we would have to move beyond ideas of resolution and the volumetric in relation to mapping. I don't have time to elaborate on that right now, but we can maybe discuss that later if you would like. But how do you think of a kind of more entangled, I suppose, relationship with the Earth? So what I'm really trying to do here is to somehow link the question of displacement with that of the environment and ecology, and to do this through the question of architectural and geographical representation. And so the few minutes I have left, I'm going to talk a little bit again about sort of Pakistan. Again, so this video is actually close to the Pakistan-Iran border, which is where a lot of the undocumented migrants I'm speaking about have to kind of cross. So the dust storm also becomes, a way of helping you across the border. But we also know that it's a very hostile environment. But I suppose, the point I made earlier about where we start matters. So this is Karachi, again, a bus stop on the outskirts of Karachi, where a lot of people start their journey on their way towards Europe. And here, networks of smuggling of people and goods come together. So there's a kind of community that coalesces around these smuggling practices that supports an economy and a way of life. And to pay attention to these communities that coalesce around the border, understood in all of its complexity, I would say produces narratives that don't always, produce perfect victims from a humanitarian regret, if you can put it that way. So, from the petty official who sort of checks IDs at random, to the smuggler who can help you pass through a checkpoint somewhere near the Pakistan-Iran border, to the young boy you see in the image who, might make you a cup of chai on your way. And so these are all incredibly important actors in the functioning of borders and the displacement they enact. And so we've been working in various ways. We've been doing small-scale sort of workshops. These are kind of workshops we did with the Marvi and the fisher folk of Gamadar, trying to understand their lives as they're entangled across the land and the sea, and of course their kind of role in helping people cross the Pakistan-Iran border as well. And all of this is sort of leading towards this kind of idea of a kind of composite Apache globe, this kind of mapping platform that we're developing, thinking we're accessing the notion of Apache Anthropocene, of course. So not a sealed impermeable surface, but a kind of layered surface that speaks not only of the limits of seeing through digital technologies, but also through our own positionalities, what we can see from a particular point of view, and then the capacities that we also deliberately bring into this platform in order to not reveal certain details on theirs. So just to end, an atlas otherwise would be attended to the materiality that has been unaccounted for, but it would also be attended to the need to move beyond questions of invisibility or provoking simplistic responses to this notion of value, migration, and circularity, and instead it would engage seriously with the work that such images do in the world. How do they make certain lives and worlds illegible or mournable or addressable on their own terms? And at the same time, I guess it's the kind of geographic, historical, and affective work that has to be done together through these kind of different, let's say, entanglements. And so for us, the point of view is incredibly important. Apache growth doesn't jump together, it's disjointed. So the question of how you navigate through opacity and through this patchiness becomes a really important point. And here we were working with ideas and narrative in order to work through this platform. But I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. you, Nishat.
See if I can work out how to stop sharing. Give me a second.
Okay. We have different possibilities of how to resolve the problem that Imani's not can't share. I think I'm gonna try, because I just joined the call, I'm gonna try if I can share screen, because Imani just sent me. Is that visible for everyone?
Great.
Yeah?
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm gonna.
So I'll just ask you to advance, if that's okay.
Yes, I think that's probably best.
Fabulous. Okay. So thanks, y'all. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak and to share some thoughts on a recently launched investigation by Forensic Architecture that was conducted along with a number of partners and collaborating organizations, a large team within FA and the MAFA program as well. So the investigation is into a continuum of environmental racism in a place called Death Alley, Louisiana. I will allow, if we can go to the next slide, I'll allow one of our partners, Sharon Levine, to, oh dear, need permission to do the video. So these are all like saved in my drive, aren't they? Hooray. Tech trouble. Are you have you requested access?
Did.
Shit. Sorry, guys.
No, that's fine. I mean,
There are 4 videos in here, so. I'm going to see if I can go ahead and open up permissions for all of them. So you should be able to access this first one now.
Yeah.
The next one, do you want to just quickly do it should we just do this really quickly? While this is happening, I guess I can share a little bit about the context. So the next, if you don't click on it, maybe if we want to just go and do permissions quickly. If you want to just request access for the subsequent slide, for the next slide. Yeah.
Okay.
So while I'm doing this, so essentially in the U.S. state of Louisiana, there is a region that is known today as Cancer Alley. It is a 85-mile stretch of the lower Mississippi River, and runs between the state capital of Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And this region, known as Death Alley, is more formally called called the Petrochemical Corridor, and it's so called for more than 200 petrochemical plants that occupy this area, and each petrochemical plant occupies at least one, but generally upwards of 3 former sugarcane plantations. So this region, petrochemical corridor, was once known as plantation country. In the U.S. state of Louisiana, there were over 500 sugarcane plantations. Okay, that should be the last one that needs permission. Sugarcane plantations in this area. The economy turned to cotton, going a bit further north into the state. But the sugar districts were notorious for being having a negative demographic birth rate among the enslaved population as a result of the incredibly intensive mode of industrial agriculture and deplorable labor conditions, conditions of forced labor. Today, the communities that are sharing property lines with these petrochemical plants are comprised of the descendants of people who were formerly enslaved on those same plantations. So by doing a deep sort of dive into the historic record, into various forms of knowledge production and sharing, we can start to understand the way that environmental violence is a continuum that spans from colonial genocide and slavery, all the way to ecological collapse and climate change. And we can see the way that the same communities of people are impacted generation after generation, are most impacted generation after generation, but also opportunities for rupture. So this investigation is it looks into certain nodes of rupture, nodes of resistance within this necroscape. So again, now I'll allow Sharon Levine, one of our closest partners with the Fence Line community activist group Rising James, to introduce the context and the stakes involved. If you could please hit play. There is sound, is that possible?
We might be muted.
I am muted.
Skype. There you go. I hope so.
Yeah, cool. Don't worry about it.
I'm sorry, Imani.
Just go on. Yeah, so let's just go forward.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so essentially before you hit play, I'll just, I don't know, maybe let's hope that these videos work at all. I'll just share a little bit about what Sharon's going to, she's going to say. So,
There you go.
So in 2019, 4 cemeteries holding the remains of historically enslaved people were identified on the construction site of a new petrochemical facility owned by Formosa Plastics. The petrochemical plant is intended to be 3.5 square miles, and it would produce nurdles, which are plastic pellets, the smallest unit of plastic production. These plants, these cemeteries were identified not by the company, not by the state, incredibly mandated process of cultural resource survey, but were identified by the community, the local community.
Sorry, Imani, we have some sound problems. Can you just stop for a second, please? Sorry.
No worries.
I'm gonna mute this. I hate technique. The presentation is on here.
Sorry.
Yeah. It just won't. Should we go out and decide and go back in? Let's just try Should we do Rudo? No. For Imani? No. Can we try this?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just gonna ask them if that's okay for Imani, can you hear us? No, she's not. I'll mute it. You should try to mute the microphone.
Should I go ahead?
Not yet.
I mean, if we can hear her now, we can just not
हम जब
play.
शिकार में जा रहे होते हैं तो
None of the other videos have
हमारा
sound.
जो होता है वो अपनी जज़ाइर से होता है कि हम अपनी
We really loved it, Marvi, so.
None of the other videos have sound, so.
Should we just, sorry, oh, okay, okay, sorry, I think we can't manage to do sound today.
Yeah.
It's okay, none of the other videos have sound, so it's just that one I wanted to let
Okay.
Jacqueline speak in her own words, but it's okay. So let's just go ahead and present. So what I was just sharing is that the community knew that it was likely that there were cemeteries of historically enslaved people on the plantations that constituted Formosa's planned construction site. As such, they hired an archaeological firm to investigate, and these 4 cemeteries were indeed identified. So, you know, these cemeteries have, in a way, become the front lines of resistance against these petrochemical plants. The Rise St. James and other local activist groups are demanding a moratorium on petrochemical expansion. They say that St. James is full. It has some of the highest rates of cancer in the U.S. It has suffered some of the highest rates of COVID-19 mortality in the U.S., as well as a plethora of other public health crises as a result of the more than 200 facilities that occupy these grounds. So they invited forensic architecture in to intervene, and we decided to intervene on 2 different registers, on the register of the air and the register of the ground, and wanted to contribute some of our longstanding methodologies around fluid dynamics simulation in order to help to confirm what local residents have been saying for many generations, that the air is being toxified by these plants, that their health is being imperiled, that they're being silenced, but that not just the fence line Black descendant communities are being impacted, but that there is a much larger regional impact, and of course that we can't see it at the scale planetary impact of the rampant development of this region. And in addition to blocking petrochemical expansion, certainly there is a deep desire to recover these ancestral sites so that the people can honor their ancestors, but also understand who they are, right? There had previously been many local efforts to uncover the locations of these so-called lost sites, these lost cemeteries across the region, but residents are greatly impeded by the pervasiveness of private property. So all of these plantations that form this seamless mosaic along the river are in private hands. They're not owned by the petrochemical industry or other forms of industry themselves. They're owned by industrial farms and many property owners who intend to sell their land ultimately to petrochemical companies. It's certainly not in their interest for Black cemeteries to be discovered. These historic sites would impede their ability to sell their land. And as such, remote sensing and mapping becomes an incredibly important tool to recover what one might call lost history, but we have learned to better say erased history, willfully lost, willfully erased history, and so I'll share some of that. So in addition to fluid dynamics simulation, we realized while we were charged by Rise St. James and their legal team to try to develop a new methodology, one that would enable us to identify the probable locations of cemeteries prior to industry breaking ground. Maybe go ahead and play, actually. Let's see if this plays, if there's like the same problem. So in terms of simulating the climate of racism that today takes the form of toxic air emissions, we worked with a long-standing collaborator at Imperial College London to simulate emissions from many dozens of individual release points from 33 industrial facilities across a 60-kilometer area. We decided to focus on 6 industrial pollutants, 5 gases, as well as particulate matter. And we simulated these emissions in various wind conditions at various points which are prevailing at different points of the year. And this allows us to show which communities are getting gassed most consistently over the course of 12 months, but also to show how communities across the region, majority white communities, who have intentionally blocked the construction of facilities in their own communities are in fact getting gas, albeit from a few miles away. We can go to the next slide, please. This is the same slide, slide 4, please. Right, thank you. But in order to understand the continuum of environmental racism, we of course needed to go back in time. We need to go deeper into the layers of structural racism that make up this place. And as such, our team, in this effort to try to recover these ancestral sites, sourced a great deal of historic and archival material. We pulled together 140 years, in fact, of historic maps, charts, surveys, aerial photography, and satellite imagery. And by georeferencing them, pinning them to satellite images, mosaicing them, and layering them, we were able to basically create a portal to allow us to travel back and forth in time and trace the transformation of the land according to first racial capitalist principles, spatial principles, and then also trace the development of this region according to evolving industrial principles. So trace the initial reconstruction of the landscape into industrial monocrop agriculture, and then follow it forward to the imposition of the petrochemical industry. What's interesting about this process of analysis is we learned that sugarcane plantations followed a very strict spatial logic. Every single structure on a sugarcane plantation, the organization of the fields, was all done in order to maximize efficiency, to reduce the time that it would take the enslaved to travel across these massive expanses of land many miles deep. And of course, ultimately, to increase the profit of the slave master and enforce racial segregation, right, by separating out the parts of the plantation that are more like a luxury estate for the slave master from the industrial components, the industrial sector of the plantation where the enslaved people would live alongside sugar mills. And by studying some of these historic maps, can we go forward one? Oh, sorry, before we do that, before we go forward, let me just share what we're looking at here. So this is sort of one way of visualizing the kind of like the layers of history here. And by using remote sensing, by sourcing these maps and aerial images and satellite images and analyzing them and overlaying it with data as well from the state, on, in red, existing petrochemical facilities, as well as sites that have already been designated as so-called development-ready sites in yellow. So in yellow, we're seeing what we're calling future industry. So sites that the state of Louisiana has declared ready for industrial development. We're able to travel not just back and forth in time from the present to the deep past 300 years ago, but also toward the future, right, to see the way that these communities are being planned out of existence and the complete nihilism with which the state is managing development in a state that is facing an extreme number of compounding environmental crises and is at the front line of, has not just the highest rates of cancer in the US, but is also at the front lines of climate change. Let's go forward now. Yes, and so by studying these maps, you can see this is a map from 1878, so it's from the post-Bellum era, the era after the emancipation of historically enslaved people, when plantations were actually in a process of reconstruction. It's an era called Reconstruction, and people who were now free no longer wanted to live in these slave cabins that were at the center of the plantation, a mile and a half deep into sugarcane fields. So when we look at these historic maps from the postbellum era, we're really looking at 2 or even 3 eras combined, as some plantations retain the spatial structure of the era of slavery, and then other ones started to transform. And we could also see these communities start to grow up out of rows of former slave quarters. But here what I have marked off in red are 3 different ways of representing or not representing the location of a cemetery. So we started to notice patterns in where cemeteries were located in relation to the central plantation road, in relation to the slave quarters, which we see in generally 1 or 2 rows, in relation to the river, in relation to the forest, and in relation to the property borders. But we also notice that not all cemeteries are mapped. And that when cemeteries are mapped, they use a widely varying symbolic logic. If we go forward 1 more, we can see now an aerial, the first available aerial photography. This is from 1940, and we can see these 3 the locations of these 3 mapped and 1 unmapped cemetery. So at the far left, the Point Homeless Plantation Cemetery appears as this sort of dark gray square, which we know to be a square of vegetation. Same with the one on the far right. It's another confirmed cemetery that also appears as a grove of vegetation. And the one at the very top center is the Orange Grove Plantation Cemetery, which is in fact not mapped. We can go forward 1 more. And tracing it forward even more to the present era, we can see how even these groves of trees have transformed, have grown in the case of the Homeless or Monroe Plantation Cemetery at the far right, and have shrunk in the case of the one on the far left. The Point Homeless Plantation Cemetery today is only marked by a single oak tree. And we can of course also see the industrial facilities that have come to dominate some of these fallow sugarcane plantations. So let's go forward more. Again, just looking at the Homeless or Monroe Plantation Cemetery as it's mapped in 1878 and as it appears as this grove of trees. So of course there's this question, that comes to one as they're doing this research of what are these groves of trees? And we learned, and it's interesting to note that, like the cemetery is mapped as this oval shape, right, which is kind of reminiscent of how it actually appears to this day, that these cemeteries were carefully cultivated spaces, and that enslaved people were actually denied stone to mark grave sites, and as such they often used simple wooden grave markers which would decompose over time, not leaving any trace. But sometimes they actually followed a deep Pan-African tradition, a form of cultural or eco-cultural or eco-philosophical retention of planting trees, certain species of trees, to mark the grave sites of their loved one. And as a result, these grave markers not only survived to the present era, but they have actually thrived and multiplied. And so we've learned from an archaeological report done on this specific cemetery that the trees in this grove are very likely to be descendants of the original trees that were planted by the historically enslaved. So let's go forward, please. So what we're looking at here is a 3D model that was created by colleagues Omar Farwani and Nicholas Masterton, and through a program called Unreal Engine. It's actually gaming software that we were able to use in a very careful way to bring visuality to this deep history that is beyond the scope of our vision, right? Because the reduced lines and forms of the maps hardly give us a sense of the scale and the atmosphere and the feel of these places. So this 3D model was created as a part of a larger investigation of several sugarcane plantations. And we chose to model several because it allows us to actually test out the standardization of industrial sugarcane spatial organization. We can kind of move seamlessly between one and the other and show the consistency see in the formation and orientation and placement of structures and other sites such as the cemetery. Let's go forward one more. And this is going to be a video. So what this Unreal model actually also allows us to do is recreate, the transformation of the land, to understand like that the cemetery is not just this cultivated ecological space, but it is also a remnant of the primordial forest, which had to be cleared in order for sugarcane to expand to its most profitable extent. So what we're looking at now is a recreation of, sort of a time lapse of the retreat of the forest and the expansion of sugarcane fields between 1821 and 1878. This is based on a combination of resources from these historic maps to a survey from 1821 that we have from the same plantation to other forms of primary and secondary material. Now, because sugarcane was a crop of scale, as planters' wealth increased, as the enslaved population increased due to these breeding programs that they had in place on these sites, these brutal sites, the acres of cultivated field expanded, the primordial forest was pushed back toward the back swamps. And we can kind of start to understand the way that the industrialization of this land, the imposition and maintenance of racial capitalism and of structural racism occurs in tandem with ecological collapse, with deforestation and the exhaustion of this landscape. Let's go forward one more, please. And, oh dear, so this is one last video. Do you want to do it now? And as we start to understand the transformation of this landscape, the way that environment, the specific form that environmental racism takes in Louisiana as, just request access, just the same way as before. Let's see. Okay, you should have permission now. Great. So as we're starting to show the way that to understand and reveal the way that ecosystems are transformed and erased, we can also understand the way that Black cultural and historic sites are transformed and erased in the second half of this time frame, right? In order to make way for industrial development. And this is an example of 6 other potential cemeteries that we were able to identify. So yeah, this is great. Going back to these this mosaic from 1940, we can see that we were able to identify over 1,000 so-called anomalies. So these groves of trees or other types of marks or discolorations visible in the 1940 aerial set. This number of almost 1,200 possible cemeteries or other forms of historic sites, because some of them are also the remnants of slave quarters and industrial facilities, was reduced to fewer than 350 by 2021. So what this portal allows us to do is start to recover the memory of the land. And let's go forward to the last slide. Oh, which is of course not showing up. I don't know why. Anyway. Yeah. Classic. So ultimately what we were able to do with all of this information is generate this field of probability. So what you should be looking at here is a heat map that used an analytics called from our map interpretation in order to show the parts of a single plantation and plantations across the region where cemeteries are more likely to be located. Now, what this model most importantly reveals is that there is nowhere that is low probability of holding cemeteries of the historically enslaved. The entire landscape, rather, is revealed as a site of immense cultural, historical, and sacred value that needs to be protected, and that is threatened by the heightened continued development of this region. And our work now is to take all of this material, we're scoping the building out of the public platform that will enable it to be accessible by local activists and their legal teams in order to drive forward their demand for a moratorium on petrochemical expansion. Thanks very much, and thanks for bearing with me through all the
Thank you so much, Imani, and thank you for having this amazingly coherent, throughout our technological difficulties, amazingly coherent speech. Thank you so much. I think we very quickly move on to Rudo, because we're already a lot over time, and I'm not sure if Nishat had to go, but yeah, Rudo, please. I hope this works.
Okay, I'll do my best. Can you hear me okay? Let's start there.
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll be quick. First, just want to acknowledge, a series of amazing and powerful and really important presentations, Imani and Nishat, and also the work that you are doing. So I think it's really great, and I'm honored to be able to share a little bit with you following that. So let me see if I can avoid tech issues. All right, let me know if that's coming through.
Yeah?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, all right. Great. Yeah, so I'm a practitioner with digital democracy, so I work for an NGO that focuses on building technologies in co-creation with Indigenous and marginalized peoples. So what I thought I'd do today is just share with you kind of a series of different vignettes. I kind of reflected on the theme of thresholds and visibility a lot. And so I don't have one specific project, but I just have a series of kind of ideas and experiences and things that came to mind as I was thinking about this panel. And I thought I'd start actually with something that grounds me, which is an experience I had working with a community in Miami, actually in 2005. Just kind of what gave me my inspiration to do the kind of work that I do. So this was 2005 until 2007, right before the housing crisis in the United States, where there was already a lot of foreclosures in Miami and a huge homeless population, right? And so there was this organization called Take Back the Land, led by Mazhar, who decided to basically take power into their own hands and look at all this empty land that was situated in Miami and forcefully erect a shantytown there for the homeless, for two different reasons. One, to provide a home for the different homeless people in Miami, and secondly, as kind of a statement pointing out the contradictions of the fact that there's all this empty land and homeless people at the same time, and the state could easily do something about that, but chooses not to because, well, capitalism. So there was this shantytown that stood there for about a year and a half called Umoja Village, and it was this really powerful experience. It was basically a community. There was a library, there was a shared kitchen. The man in the photo here, John Cada, was very proud about erecting his own white picket fence around his particular house that he lived in. And it was this really beautiful kind of experience in Miami where a lot of activists stood in solidarity with the Umoja Village, and again, stood for a year and a half. And the state almost didn't know what to do with it because it was this powerful community-supported initiative, but obviously it was illegal. And so at some point, mysteriously, there was a fire that broke out, and literally a few hours later, this happened about 3 in the morning, a few hours later, bulldozers showed up by the state to kind of tear it down, which seemed like way too much of a coincidence, of course, for that to have happened only hours after there was a quote-unquote fire that, was supposed to have just happened accidentally. And that was a big deal. The homeless people had to vacate, the state board kind of fenced off the property. And what you're seeing in the picture on the left there is what it looks like today. It's just empty land again. And I wasn't around when this project started, but I found out about it a few years ago, and it occurred to me that the story of Umoja Village was literally wiped off the map, right? It was physically wiped off the map, of course, the physical space, but also nobody knew about it anymore, and it kind of got forgotten after a few years. So I was working at the University of Miami Libraries at the time, and the archivist there, Beatriz Cocan, was very interested in kind of stories from marginalized communities like the Haitian American population in Miami, and kind of documenting those and bringing visibility to those. We decided to tell the story of Umoja and to deposit it in the archives there as a way to legitimate those experiences and also ensure that the stories aren't lost. So we did a series of oral histories recordings with the homeless people as well, kind of focusing on their experience of what it was like living at this shanty town, and really ensuring that those stories aren't lost in time, you know. And that was something that really gave me a lot of inspiration in terms of what the kind of work that I wanted to do when I started to move into the NGO space, and led me to kind of there we go. You see what you're seeing on the screen there, making sure that it's reflecting what I'm seeing, okay. Yeah, it got me into sort of GIS and mapping and thinking about how maps can tell different stories than the kind of dominant ones. You know, everybody is aware of how mapping was sort of one of these like powerful forces of colonialism, right? How maps were used to describe empty land, which made it seem possible for colonial powers to claim it as empty and therefore appropriate to colonize. And so I became really interested in how maps can be used to tell counter-narratives to that and erase the borders that have been set during the times of colonialism and really tell a different story, right? So this is an indigenous map from the Haudenosaunee community, which is northern New York, southern Canada by the Ontario, kind of Great Lakes region. And in Canada, you know, Indigenous mapping really took off as a powerful movement where, like I was, you know, some of the earlier panelists talked about the limits of maps and how they, you know, because of the way that they're represented, it's a certain kind of Western epistemology as well, but they can also be very powerful, right? It's a way to provide a different narrative that the communities, and, you know, in many cases, maps have been used in court and have had real impacts as well. And so I became really interested in like the power of maps, and in Canada they call this maps that roar. You know, maps that have such a powerful effect that they roar and can actually engender social change and even legal change. So I started to work more in that field, and in 2015 I was working with an organization called the Amazon Conservation Team in Suriname, which is a former Dutch colony in South America, kind of an unknown place. You know, they don't speak Spanish or Portuguese there, so for a lot of people, like South America, Spanish, Portuguese speaking, and so Suriname doesn't really fit into the kind of boundaries of what people imagine as South America. And there's a series of communities that live in the rainforest called Maroons, and Maroons are descendants of formerly enslaved Africans who over 300 years ago escaped from the plantations at the time, settled in the rainforest, and actually were able to overpower the Dutch in a lot of cases, going on raids to rescue their brothers and sisters from slavery and liberate them and bring them into the rainforest. And at some point it became so powerful that they actually forced the Dutch to sign a peace treaty with them, and that legitimated their right to exist in the rainforest. And so there's 6 Maroon communities in Suriname, and they continue to exist there to the present day. They don't currently have land rights anymore because when Suriname became independent in 1975, the Surinamese government said, oh, well, those treaties were with the Dutch, and now we're all Surinamers, so we all have to share this land now. And so the communities are working very hard to get land rights, and maps can be really instrumental in that, right? And the other thing is that there's a lot of threats in the form of environmental degradation and pollution taking place in the Maroon territory. So this is an aerial image of small-scale gold mining, which is frequently done illegally. Concessions are given out by the state, sometimes as well, legally, that give people the right to do mining in the Maroon territory, and it's just terribly toxic. I mean, the small-scale gold mining, I won't go into the details too much, but it uses mercury to separate the gold out from the rest of the soil, and then the mercury tends to either get thrown in the river, which poisons the fish, so that people eat the fish, or it even just evaporates in the environment. It can actually stay around for thousands of years. It's a really terrible kind of toxic effect that is already having an impact on the health of the people. There's some scientific studies that have shown that. So the Matawai, they wanted to have maps of their land in order to show where that gold mining is taking place relative to their territory, right? And their ancestral knowledge and historical sites actually that go back, you know, hundreds of years to when their ancestors first arrived in this territory and settled it and fought against, again, the Dutch for their right to exist there. So we started this mapping project. They invited the Amazon Conservation Team at the time because ACT had already done some work with neighboring communities to do mapping. And so we started just by doing paper maps and having kind of like having a river and having folks draw on the map their knowledge of the land. And what came out of that was just this tremendous repository of knowledge held by the elders, the women in the community as well, some of the kids too, just of different, like everything that has a name, a place name, and a story attached to it. That again goes back to this really sort of foundational moment for them when their ancestors first arrived in this landscape, which to them defines a large part of their worldview, really. So, we were gathering this data in order to have a territory map of the Matawai that we could overlay with the threats. But what came out of that was a lot of storytelling and the importance of story attached to places on the map. So, and this came out especially in expeditions, right, where there were a lot of younger Matawai who kind of grew up in the city and never had the experience to be exposed to a lot of that story as we were doing. So our job, as NGO, was mainly to sort of facilitate and help the younger Matawai use the technology to be able to map the land, so using GPS and smartphones and things like that. But it was just a tremendous experience of storytelling where the boatsmen, and the folks that were joining us were able to hear some of these stories for the very first time and really experience this transmission of knowledge of who they are as a people, right, and where they come from and why this is their land. Which was a really powerful experience, and there were a few moments, that really come to mind here. One, sitting down, our team, which was composed of, us from the NGO side as well as the community, with the lady on the left, whose name is Dora Flink, who was identified as just a really phenomenal storyteller and somebody who keeps a lot of knowledge. And so we wanted to verify the maps with her to ensure that they were accurate, that we were not missing anything that's important. And so the team had a list of places that they heard about that they wanted to ask her where they were located, so that we could put them on a map. And immediately when you name a place, he just began to tell this beautiful story of what had happened there years ago. She started to sing different songs. She grabbed objects nearby to illustrate, boats on the river, and just this really important kind of storytelling that came out of that. And we were just mapping place names, which is really this moment of realizing that we needed to do more than just produce maps. Another moment on the right, and I think this could be interesting also for folks in academia. There's only 2 books written about the Matawai. Both of them are dissertations, and one of them was published, which is the book that you're seeing there from people in between, right? Anthropologist couple from the Netherlands who lived there in the 80s, and they wrote this book initially in Dutch. I think it was translated to English, and they never really brought it back, but they never really brought it back to the community. And so we got a hold of this book and wanted to show it to some of the folks that we were working with, and to kind of show them the pictures, especially because there were photos in there that many of the community members had never seen. And this was a really just powerful experience where this community never had any access to any kind of physical archive of their history, of their knowledge, of their ancestors. And for the first time seeing pictures of people that they knew when they were younger, oh, that's my grandfather's brother, or that's, so-and-so, I remember her, she used to walk around in the village. And there was one moment where I showed it to one man in particular who saw the book and who was looking through the pictures, and he eventually came across a picture where he kind of paused and looked at it for a while and got kind of emotional, and it turns out it was a photo of his mother, who we haven't seen in 30 years. And he got really upset because he got angry. He said, basically, like, why do you have a picture of my mother and I don't? And it was this, he's right, like, why is that? And what can we do to better ensure that this access to these materials lies with the community? So we started to work more around kind of gathering of cultural knowledge and also linking that to places on the map. So a long story short here is that we worked with the community for a few years to gather a lot of these kind of both archival materials and doing oral history recordings. And we were able to share this with the community, and also the community wanted to share it with the public, right? Which is this question of visibility. This is kind of a marginalized community that not a lot of people know they exist, and they want to be put on the map. So they want their story to be accessible to a broader public. So we worked on the story map, which the link is available if I can share it later as well, where we sort of narrate some of the oral history and the cultural heritage of the Matawai. So using maps as well as some of the oral histories and whatever archival footage we had to kind of tell the story of how the Matawai first settled in this territory and how they started to develop this kind of connection to what is now their ancestral lands. There's a few reflections in here, that really kind of describe the ethos of the project in, I think, a really powerful way. This is, we were able to bring 3 Matawai community members to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. in the United States to be able to consult an archive from the other anthropologists that live with the Matawai, where there was a series of pictures and audio recordings and field notes. And so the Matawai were able to consult these materials and then bring them back, make scans, photocopies, etc. And there's this one quote by Tina on the left there. These anthropologists wrote things down while my people back then couldn't write. But they told stories, and then the anthropologists recorded them. And now that the people aren't with us anymore, we should be able to find the stories somewhere. And that is what we're doing now with this archive. I try to imagine how my ancestors lived back then. And that gives me a feeling of pride to be a Matawai, because it helps me to know my roots. Which, again, is just really powerful kind of statement that I think crystallizes the importance of documenting the stories and the cultural heritage and also spatial knowledge of communities and being able to use technology to facilitate that a little bit. There's limits to this as well, so this is just a different thought that I had. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with OpenStreetMap. It's an open mapping portal where anybody can contribute. It's a map of the world, and it's used a lot actually for humanitarian relief, you know, when the Red Cross or humanitarian OpenStreetMap organizations need data whenever there's a hurricane or whenever there's any kind of natural event that happens to be able to provide support. So, for humanitarian aid, it's a tool that's used quite a lot. And it's also just like an interesting project, so an open kind of mapping project that's counter to Google or, sources like that. And there's been this interesting phenomenon recently that I've been noticing that a lot of like indigenous people's villages in the Amazon have started to be mapped, because the way that this works is that there's like high resolution satellite imagery, and anybody from their armchair desk can basically draw out a lot of this data. Or people have gone somewhere, collected data, and then published it on OpenStreetMap. And so this is a village that I've been to, Sipaliwini, which is in the south of Suriname, which doesn't have internet access and nobody knows this exists. But their village has been mapped by somebody. And it raises questions around the disability and consent. I think, it's a little bit invasive and can be potentially dangerous when there's potentially features in the landscape that the community doesn't want to share. So again, thinking about thresholds of visibility and what's being shared and what should not be shared. I think this is something that's emerging now that requires a lot of attention. In the Amazon, there are some communities that are in voluntary isolation as well, and they're easily discernible with satellite imagery, and then somebody has gone ahead and drawn some of those onto this map, which is potentially problematic for lots of reasons, including that there's missionaries that want to Christianize these populations. So there's, I think, a lot of risk in this kind of movement towards the visibility and storytelling using maps in an online platform as well, that I think demands a lot of attention. So just really briefly, because I know we're running a little out of time as well. So in Digital Democracy, the organization that I work with, we're trying to take that challenge very seriously by developing tools and technologies that gives the power to communities to be able to control what gets mapped and what gets shared and what gets published and who has access. And so this is a new platform we launched a few months ago called Earth Defenders Toolkit, which is a website where we're providing different tools and approaches to using technology that encourage what's called data sovereignty, right? That communities have sovereignty over what gets shared and also what maps get created and who's in power of telling that story, right? Which is, I think, such a pivotal consideration. So there's a few tools here. One of them is called Mateo, which is a tool for mapping on a local basis, works entirely offline and is co-created with indigenous peoples. These are links that I can share as well. So this was a story map that was created by the Warani in Ecuador, who used Mateo to map their lands and overlay that with oil concessions to be able to show how petroleum extractivism is threatening the integrity of their landscape. So this was data that they collected and a story that they put together and had decisions over what gets shared and what does not get shared, because there's some information, especially oral histories that they recorded, that is not available on this map because it's just for internal usage. And then there's another tool called Terra Stories that we're working on, which is specifically for mapping oral histories, but very much taking into consideration what I just said around restricting knowledge, right? So Terra Stories is an application that we also developed with the Matawai that I mentioned earlier, thinking about the younger people and especially giving access to some of that storytelling to younger people. So it's a platform where communities can choose to share what they want to share with the public versus what is only for internal consumption. So data sovereignty is very much baked into the design of the tool, which again, in Digital Democracy is really core to how we operate as kind of a tech NGO. And then just lastly, I want to share about Native Land, which is a new kind of emerging project that you may have seen before. It tends to go viral around days like Columbus Day in the United States and Canada Day, basically any kind of settler holiday in the American context, where this is kind of a global counter mapping project, which is also crowdsourced. Well, up until now, it's been very much crowdsourced, where what you can do is, it's a map that shows basically an extent of indigenous land that doesn't purport to claim any legality or boundaries, and so it's intentionally almost fuzzy in how things are mapped, because the goal isn't necessarily to make claims over land, but to encourage discussions and thinking and more broader visibility of indigenous settlements, initially in America, now also in Africa, as well as in Northern Europe. And what we're trying to do with Native Land is also increase the access. So again, going back to data sovereignty, up until now, a lot of these maps have been contributed by folks just wanting to contribute and sharing knowledge that they know. But now Native Land is pivoting to working more with communities and giving communities control and access over sharing whatever they want to share of their land, instead of somebody else contributing that. So this is another kind of emerging platform counter to OpenStreetMap that I think has that potential baked into it. Although I think, like, just to summarize, I think there's like a lot of limits to maps, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of thresholds. It's an imperfect representation of what is otherwise a very complex worldview and relationality with landscapes. But the way that I like to think about it, which is inspired by an Ecuadorian Guarani mapper who worked on the Guarani maps, is that this isn't any way of legitimating their knowledge, right? They've never needed maps for their own internal purposes. This is to help outsiders understand how they view their land, right? So it's actually to help the ignorant folks that are in courts or that are wanting to do extractivism on their land, to help them understand what the indigenous representation of their land looks like. Although it's knowing that it's an imperfect representation, but it's to facilitate that understanding of a bit. And again, just the power of what these maps can do in terms of a visual, as a counter to colonial and sort of like standard maps with boundaries, is still incredibly important. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to share with you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rudo. Thank you, Nishat. Thank you, Imani. That was all very great. Rudo, can you stop?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Now we can see you. Yeah, that was all really, really interesting. I've really said that we had all these technical issues because we're running so much over time that we're not having any, unfortunately, no time for Q&A because there's a talk right now lined up, basically.
I mean, unless someone has a pressing question or something formulated that would like to ask, we can take like 3 minutes, 5 minutes, if that makes sense. But no, okay. It's just, yeah. So sorry, it was really great. Thank you so much. Also, I'm really happy we gave you such a broad brief, and then you came with such perfect and specific, answers and questions, and it was beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. It was a pleasure. Sorry for my contribution to the technical difficulties.
No. This is completely on our side. I have to say also that you were the first online panel, and I think we were just like so trusting in that Skype and everything will just work out that we should have probably run more tests before. Yeah. But that was great. Thank you so much for your insights. Thank you so much for your presentations and your work. And I think we're gonna wrap it up and see the next panel. Oh my God, I hate
Thank you, I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry.
You're right.